Today's topic, bad thinking and what we can do about it. When I say bad thinking, I'm thinking specifically of fallacies of reasoning. Fallacies is one of those interesting words that can refer to many, many different things. We could spend weeks just going through the many, many different ways in which thinking can be broken or thought can be broken. I remember my undergrad career being fascinated by just the sheer number of ways in which our processing of information, our processing of people's arguments and ideas can go wrong. That there are, in fact, pretty straightforward. And when you see these in just a second, you'll see these are really straightforward ways of diagnosing faulty or bad reasoning. And I apologize, my voice is going. I've been wrestling with a cold the last little while, but I think I have a little more voice in me. So let's see what we can do here. When we talk about someone's ideas or their arguments for something, so I want you to believe this, I want you to act a certain way, what am I trying to convince you of? Whatever that is, it can go wrong in a couple of ways. One, the reasons for why I want you to believe something, my premises, my arguments, the justification for why you should believe my conclusion can be false. That is, I say something, but it turns out I'm just wrong. Or the things I'm saying, I'm trying to convince you of something, are faulty and defective in some way. Maybe they'll be circular, as we're talking about, or they just violate basic laws of logic or reason. And again, we're not doing anything really complicated here. These typically get categorized as informal fallacies, but there's 15 of them today I would like to talk about. Just each one in turn, briefly. I'm going to put a chapters under the heading for the YouTube video. I'm going to put a chapter for each one of these so you can fast forward or rewind as you need to look at each of these. Each one will be given a name. There are slightly different names depending on who you're talking to, but try and get the idea here, because even if you don't remember the name for each of these fallacies, when you're living your life out in the real world, you'll realize, okay, there's something wrong here, and I don't remember the name for it, but at least I will be able to identify why what this person is saying isn't reliable, or is dangerous, or is just outright propaganda and lies. So you'll get the feeling even if you don't necessarily remember the name. I know after my first or second year, I didn't remember the names either until, of course, I started teaching it and spending more time with them. All right, without further ado, 15 major ways in which thinking goes bad or is faulty. The first big one is called the genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy. And the argument is basically that the source or the person giving the argument tells us the truth about the argument. Here's an example. Selena's argument, this is a random person, Selena's argument regarding indigenous rights can't be right because she's of European descent. Did you follow that? It's another way of saying, hey, this guy right here, he's white, so any of his arguments or his truths that he's trying to convey about indigenous rights, whatever those may be, well, we can't really listen to him because he's white. The mistake here is assuming that the merit of an argument or truth is based on a person's skin color, their genetics, where they've come from, who they are. Maybe there are different versions of this, circumstances, what kind of context, socioeconomic context that you're in. The problem is that we need to divide the truth of an argument from the person, and that can be so difficult. Sometimes the truth of an argument does relate to a person's character. If I've just gotten out of prison for my third arrest for stealing, and I go to a town hall meeting and I say, hey, you know what? We really need to lower the number of police officers in this town because we're wasting money. You would be within your right reason to be like, wait a minute, this guy's a known thief, and now he's arguing for a reduction of police officers. There may be a relevant connection there. But that needs to be made. You need to make that connection between a person's genetics, literally, and the argument they're making is somehow connected. And that's often very difficult, if not impossible. A variation of that is the ad hominem attack. The ad hominem is attacking a person. So not just dismissing an argument because of who they are, but attacking a person and not their argument. This is huge. This is pretty much entirely how political campaigns are run, attacking a person, but not what they're saying. A bad person can have a good argument. This is tough to believe, but a A bad person can have a good argument, and a good person can have a bad argument. Here's an example. You can't believe anything Morris says about welfare reform. He's a left-leaning softy. Isn't that interesting? It may be true that this Morris character is a left-leaning softy, whatever that might mean, and it may be true that his arguments are couched in his biases and prejudices, but that doesn't mean that his arguments don't have weight. They don't have value. Here's a more recent example. Many people are debating the origins of the COVID-19 virus and whether it was in a lab and whether it was released in a lab. And depending on which part of the political divide you find yourself, many people just outright dismissed, they called it a conspiracy theory. It couldn't have possibly been created in a lab. And they dismissed it very quickly because it was proposed by Trump Republican, the Republican for the Republican Party. So they dismissed it because they consider him to be a bad person. So far, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that it really was done in a lab, but that dismissiveness of someone you consider to be bad is not strong reasoning. So as a critical, rational thinker, I need to take Trump's arguments at face value and look for the evidence or wait for the evidence to arrive regarding whether or not this vaccine, or the virus rather, was created in a lab. Bad people can have good arguments. Good people can have bad arguments. Another example, we should reject Chen's argument for life on other planets because he dabbles in the paranormal. It's this idea that his extracurricular activities with paranormal somehow pollute or corrupt or negate his arguments for life on other planets. This person may dabble in the paranormal, and we may not accept the paranormal as a valid medium for truth, but that doesn't mean he's not right. Still another version of this attacking the person is the accusation of hypocrisy. So if you see somebody who's saying, save the planet, bring down your CO2 footprint, recycle, reuse, all these different things, but they drive around in a very expensive car that's highly polluting rather than a more efficient car that's less polluting, you would naturally accuse them of hypocrisy. At one point, I believe Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor of California, was pushing for environmental reform but driving around in a Hummer. So this seemed to be an obvious contradiction. How can you say one thing but do another? But here's the logic. Just because someone's actions don't match their argument, their logic, their truth claim, it doesn't mean that their truth claim isn't good. I can say, save the planet, and I can go out and pollute the planet, and my argument is actually still quite strong why we should save the planet. So a person's actions, a person's fault, maybe I'm a bad person overall, shouldn't negate the truth, potential truth of my arguments. That's a very hard thing to get over when we're used to dismissing people because of the color of their skin, maybe, wrong political party, maybe they're rich and elite, and we just wanted to naturally dismiss them as having no tenable position, and so on and so on. So the ad hominem isn't just something that other people do, nasty politicians. It's actually something that we do rather quickly, knee-jerk reaction. We first meet somebody, maybe they're not dressed as nicely as we are, or maybe they're driving a really expensive car. We have some very quick opinions formulated that may shadow the truth of what these people have to convey to us. A variation of this is the circumstantial fallacy, in which a person's circumstances are a means of dismissing them. Here's an example. Wilson claims that the political system in Cuba is terrific. So yay, Cuba. But he has to say that because he's a card-carrying communist, probably living in Cuba, so forget what he says. It's tempting, and there may be merit to that one's circumstances may blind them to the truth. But our outright dismissal of somebody because of their circumstances without hearing their argument, that's our mistake. The big ad hominem one, the poisoning of the well, that happens very often, is an attempt to simply discredit the person entirely. So here's an example. Joe has no regard for the truth, or has he's just an irrational person, non-rational motives for espousing a claim. He wants to be rich, he wants to be famous, and he wants to be powerful, but he doesn't care about people. So his arguments should be ignored. Okay, you know what? We've seen many politicians with dubious or shady intentions, very selfish, very greedy, with track records of being unkind and bad. But does that mean then that all of their arguments are without merit? No. Is it highly probable, with a historical track record of many, many years of kind of being a bad person, that maybe their arguments are going to be baseless? Yeah, maybe. But that still doesn't absolve us of hearing them out, at least initially. The title, Poisoning of the Well, is very much like it sounds like. In a village where you have basically one well, if it becomes poisoned, everybody that goes to that well is in a lot of trouble. So if you can convince people in your, wherever you are, that certain person X is like a poison well, that anything this person says will yield large-scale damage, trouble, then you've succeeded not in defeating that person's truths or arguments, but in poisoning the well, which is not a logical approach. Hitler, after, it didn't take long, but we know with Hitler, is an example of somebody who's very much a poisoned well. But what if Hitler said we should all drink milk? Now, some people, I'm not one of them, but some people think drinking milk is actually healthy. If we accepted the poisoning of the well, then people, even like Hitler, we may be missing out on the truth of what they had to say. I'm not sure that Hitler had any truth, but that's beside the point. You get the idea. Even the worst kinds of people may occasionally be right about some things, but if we're living our lives as if they were poisoned wells, we would just never know. The fallacy of composition. The fallacy argues that what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. You'll hear this quite often in the media. What's true of the parts, the individual pieces, must be true of the whole thing. The example here, the atoms that make up the human body are invisible. Well, that's true. You can't see them. They're there, but you can't see them. Therefore, the human body is invisible. What's true of the parts, the atoms, must be true of the whole. What? Well, I'm not invisible. It's kind of a big distinction there. That's not always a fallacy. For example, if I was to say the house had pieces, it was made of wood, made out of pieces of wood, therefore the house is wood, that's largely correct. This house is 90% made of wood. But what if I was to say those Mexicans coming across the southern border, they're all rapists and criminals? So it's, well, no, they're not all rapists and criminals. So it's that composition mistake of saying that what makes up a small proportion now makes up a whole proportion, which is obviously not the case. If we flip the one on composition, we have the fallacy of division. The fallacy of division argues that what is true of the whole must be true of the parts. What is true of the whole must also be true of the little pieces. Here's an example. A university degree is a valuable thing to have. So how can you possibly think that this course in underwater basket weaving isn't valuable? Underwater basket weaving would be super cool, but I'm not sure how practical that would be or even theoretically valuable. Claiming that the parts are the same as the whole, obvious mistake. Claiming that what is true of the whole must be true of the parts, obvious mistake. Here's one going on in my economy right now in terms of jobs. Don't tell me you've had trouble finding a job. Unemployment in this entire country is at an all-time low. So when you say the whole thing in terms of unemployment, most people seem to be getting jobs. Therefore, your argument that you've had a hard time finding a job can't be true. Well, of course it can be true, especially depending on the job you're actually going for. It may be true, a lot of ways around this, but it may be true that most of the jobs available are minimum wage, and the job you're going for to sustain a family and to be able to eat is more than minimum wage. Ergo, you're having a hard time finding a sustainable job or a good job. This is just another example of how these fallacies lead us astray. They're overly simplistic and dangerous in that respect. This is also quite popular when you see political arguments. It doesn't matter what station, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, CBC, all these different stations. When you see people having political arguments, often, so here's an example. Kellyanne Conway was a former White House representative, and they were talking about immigration. I forget what channel it was on or which station. But basically, the reporter asked why they kept referring to these dangerous criminals at the southern border when the Department of Homeland Security says that on average these people are less trouble than native citizens. And so the reporter said, why do you keep talking about why they're dangerous? And Kellyanne Conway's response was to say, to immediately pivot on the point, these are other fallacies we're going to look at too, but to pivot on that point and use the word dangerous to represent a different demographic or a different population or a different problem. So it became an issue of equivocation by what did you mean by dangerous? What were you pointing to with the term dangerous? Equivocation is using the same word in two different ways in the same context or the same argument. So the same word, but you're switching it up, which is slimy, but we sometimes do it without realizing it. Here's an example. Only man is rational. No woman is a man, therefore no woman is rational. Do you get the different senses of man there? The first one is the universal human. No human is rational, which is typically how we'd write it these days, whereas the second one refers to a gender, male or female. So we're using humankind now versus male. That's a fallacy of equivocation. Here's a better one of equivocation. Someone, let's call him Peter, says, it is well known that the average family has 2.5 children. The respondent, let's call him Ken, says, well, Linda's family over there is very average. Conclusion, they must have 2.5 children. What's going on here is the fallacy of equivocation. Nobody really has 2.5 children, right? Unless you're doing some weird counting. I don't know how you'd count half a person. So they probably have 2 or they have 3. So the first one is referring to a statistical anomaly or statistical number. That is, on average, when you take everybody in the country and you see how many children they have, it works out to 2.5 children. But then the other person is actually using a literal example of this family right here, and the claim that they have 2.5 children becomes nonsensical. It's just that easy to be mistaken or confused. And this becomes very important when you're talking about major healthcare choices or financial decisions, and people are using a statistical average versus a literal concrete example right here and now average, which are two very different things, obviously, as you saw with this case. Here's another. You are against murder, so you should be against capital punishment as well. You're against murder, so you should be against capital punishment. If we unpack this a little bit, you have to unpack it just a tiny bit. The idea is that all murder is bad and you're against murder, okay? But then we go further. Capital punishment is killing. Capital punishment is when a country decides through its court system, usually this is how it works, through a court system, if they have capital punishment, that a person should be put to death. So one is talking about murder where an individual, typically an individual, goes out and kills another individual for personal reasons. And the other one, murder, is of a country through judicial courts, lawyers, juries, make a collective decision about retribution or punishment. Now, some people will say murder is murder, it's all the same. Others will say, no, that's two examples of where actually the word murder applies maybe here, but it doesn't apply when you're talking about capital punishment. Listen, we don't always agree that there is equivocation happening, but in this case, yeah, we're thinking about these things differently. So the argument you are against murder, so you should be against capital punishment, that doesn't follow at all. I can be against murder and think murder is bad as the intentional killing of an innocent person. Murder is the intentional killing of an innocent person. But then I'm for capital punishment, which I'm not. But if I could be for capital punishment, which is one society's version of justice, an eye for an eye, Lexis Tallianus as an example. Appeal to popularity. You've heard about peer pressure. You've no doubt been trained in some respect to conform to social norms and social expectations. But what happens when we begin to believe things or argue for things simply because a lot of people believe it? It's interesting because we'll often, and you can see this again in the media, where a group of people will dismiss another group by claiming that group is appealing to popularity. They're just believing whatever they're being told without really thinking it through. But that group who's accusing the other group, it's sort of almost an ad hominem fallacy as well, they're doing the same thing. What is appeal to popularity? Here's an example. Most people approve of the government's decision not to pay for in vitro fertilization treatment. So I guess that decision must be a good one. Why? Why must that decision be a good one? Just because people approve of a government, and this goes back to questions of democracy, just because the majority think it's a good idea doesn't mean it's a good idea at all. We could switch that up just a little bit, and instead of saying that most people believe X, therefore X must be good, we can say that most people do Y, therefore Y must be good. Here's an example. There's nothing wrong with cheating a bit on your taxes. I read somewhere that nearly half of the taxpayers lie about something on their tax returns. That's just an excuse, isn't it? Just because a lot of people do something, think something, we need to look at the truth. We need to weigh the logical evidence involved in that. Closely associated with the appeal to popularity, what most people think most of the time is kind of, that must be true. We also have this idea of appeal to tradition, which most people probably believe most of the time to be a good thing. That this culture has done this since time immemorial, or this culture just does it routinely. Therefore, it's probably a good thing. And obviously the logic there doesn't necessarily follow. Example, acupuncture has been used for 1,000 years in China. It must work. Acupuncture has been used for 1,000 years in China. It must work. Must it? Slavery has been used for, millennia. It must work. No. We've always had Sunday service at 7 a.m. Okay. Why not move to 8? It's kind of a lazy way to think in a way. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we can't mix things up and improve. This one's a little tricky. The appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance. And it presents in different ways, but basically the idea is someone claims that because you do not have evidence for something, that proves something. You do not have evidence for X, therefore we must believe Y. Right? They follow. You see an example in just a second. This is a classic one. Again, because we don't have evidence, you must believe. Well, must I believe? Example, it's clear that God exists because science hasn't proven that God doesn't exist. Whoa, okay. So God must exist because science hasn't shown there's no God. Is a lack of evidence really evidence? In this case, a lack of evidence is just showing our ignorance. It's just showing a lack of evidence. That's all. It's not always like that, which we'll see in a second, but most of the time, a lack of evidence is just a lack of evidence. Another example, no one has shown that ghosts aren't real, so they must be real. That seems silly, but consider how many of your daily activities are based on this idea. Well, no one's told me that jumping off this cliff is not safe, so I'm going to give it a whirl. No one's told me that, going to parties in the middle of the age of COVID is unsafe, so I'm just going to do it. No one's shown me, and I haven't seen the facts to show me that masks actually work, so I'm not going to wear one. No, a lack of evidence is just a lack of evidence. That is not grounds for a positive affirmation of something true. Unless you do this. There are exceptions to this fallacy in which a lack of evidence can be proven, or can be used rather, to demonstrate something, at least provisionally. If I'm looking for a spare part for my truck and I go to a used car lot and I'm searching around and I go through the first car and I can't find the part I need, a second car, a third car, and I go through the whole lot and I can't find the part I need, and I go to the front desk and I'm like, are you sure you have this part? And they say, well, we just don't know. And I said, well, I think I have evidence because I have searched through this whole junkyard. I cannot find the part. My lack of evidence, but the fact that I've searched for it, is provisionally some pretty substantive ground for saying something doesn't exist. Somebody who's looking for polar bears that are green, they need to go and look. If they don't go and look, then that's not evidence. A lack of seeing something doesn't count unless you're investigating it. Associated with this is the burden of proof. Often people who don't have very strong grounds for an argument, they don't have very much weight to their truth, will try to reverse the burden of proof. They'll use this thing where, well, show me your evidence. They don't have any, but show me your evidence. But the weight of showing evidence for something is usually on the person who's making the positive affirmation, the person who's saying there is a car part, a truck part for you in this junkyard. It's up to them to demonstrate that it's true. Don't let them just rely on the fact that, well, no one's shown me that there aren't any parts in here that you need, so there must be parts in there. That's terrible. That's terrible logic. Here are some funny things, funny examples of some headlines you may have seen. How do you know I can't do psychic surgery? Show me that space aliens don't exist. Isn't it worth $16 a month to protect your family with $250,000 worth of life insurance, and so on? All of these are examples of people switching the burden of proof to make you come up with evidence for something when it's probably lacking. They don't have strong grounds, so they try and bait you into coming up with something. The next is appeal to emotion. And this is comically bad. Comically bad in the sense that it's so widespread, again, especially among public figures, politicians especially, who want to rile up their base, but they have no really strong grounds for thinking. They have no great reasons or evidence really for their position. So they appeal to emotion. The caricatures of some of these people, it's just so demeaning in a way, how they treat others. That party is bad. Why? Well, I'm not going to give you grounds or reasons for saying they're bad, but I'm going to rile up your emotions, your hatred, your excitement to be the winning side and them the losing side. Here's an example of kind of a baseless emotional claim instead of an actual argument. You should hire me for this position. I'm the best person for the job. If I don't get a job, my wife is going to leave me. Come on, give me a break. We live in a culture that is constantly trying to persuade, even manipulate us with empty words that are filled with emotion, but not strong reasons for why we ought to believe something. And how often do we actually believe it? The recent political campaign in my country, you watch the empty rhetoric and the hatred and the vitriol. These were appeals to emotion. These are fallacies that we should not respect at all. And we should actually go out of our way to dismiss as dangerous. The fallacy of red herring. Red herring. Yes, after the fish, as odd as it may sound. If you're ever being tracked down by the police and they have their dogs hunting after you, you just find yourself a smelly red herring and you put a trail with a smelly dead herring going that way, but then you go the other way and the police will follow the fish and not you. There, I've just saved you from criminal prosecution. The idea with the red herring is that you are deliberately misleading people and misdirecting them with irrelevant things that don't have anything to do with the argument. Go back to my previous example with Kellyanne Conway. She is a master of the red herring. So the example I had before was with Equivocation, where she used the word dangerous differently than the journalist was using the word dangerous. But she's also doing the red herring, which is taking the word dangerous in the context of immigration and pivoting to a more friendly talking point that is amenable to her position. Here's an example. Canada needs tougher immigration policies. I've got a neighbor who says we should let in more immigrants. The 60s, boy, what a great time. That was for druggies and wackos. You should see the way those hippies dressed. He hasn't figured that out, that the 1960s are over. What's going on here is that a person arguing for immigration policies, tougher immigration policies, and he's pointing to a neighbor who believes more immigrants should be allowed in, but instead of talking about the substance of the neighbor's argument, he's characterizing him as a sort of a free love hippie that hasn't figured out the 60s are over. That has nothing to do with the argument at hand, whether or not we need tougher immigration policies. It's subtle sometimes. The red herring is just distracting somebody, but the strength of the intellect, the strength of critical thinking is bringing those conversations back on track. The nightly news, the media outlets, if you watch these, 90% of them would become redundant almost overnight if they stopped all red herrings, equivocation, and these other fallacies, because the talking points would just cease. But they don't cease, and they continue on with these silly fallacies of logic because it's entertaining, it's satisfying, it's psychologically persuasive, but it's not very credible, and it's actually quite dangerous to be led astray by the red herring. Next is the straw man fallacy, or the straw person fallacy, if we're going to be gender inclusive to be fair, in which there's a distorting of someone's argument. It's an unfair distorting, so they're not practicing the principle of charity where they're representing somebody else's argument as it is in its full strength. They're contorting it in some way. And you can imagine the analogy now between trying to knock over a real person. They might be kind of heavy, blood and bones, guts, gross stuff. But a person made of straw, easy to knock over, right? Just empty straw, and there they go. So like the ad hominem fallacies that we were looking at, circumstantial, genetic, in which someone is attacking a person, here it's attacking the argument by mischaracterizing it instead of actually attacking the substance of the real argument. Very, very popular. Here's an example. I believe that AK-47s should be outlawed. That's a big automatic rifle gun. I believe AK-47s should be outlawed. No one needs that level of firepower to be protected. Okay, so it's an argument. We should ban these guns. Why should we ban the guns? Because they're disproportionate in terms of firepower to what we actually need. The straw person of that, straw person or straw man version, as we can see, this person here who's arguing for AK-47 outlawing, this person is against the use of firearms for self-protection, and so he will allow criminals to possess firearms and deny us their use. So I think AK-47s are too much. We should ban them. Person responds with the straw person argument. Therefore, you're against self-protection with firearms, and therefore you would have the criminals possess them. What? But we see this in American television all the time. They love talking about guns. But is that even remotely true? Simply because person X wants to ban one particular weapon that he thinks is disproportional to the effect doesn't mean that he's against self-protection with firearms, and it doesn't mean that he wants criminals to possess firearms, especially AK-47s. Here's a slightly less controversial example. Angela, I think we should wait until we've graduated and have jobs before we get married. Hank, his response, so having tons of money is more important to you than our being together. How could you be so materialistic? Is that what she said? No, it's not what she said. She said she wanted to wait until they graduated and had jobs before they got married. His straw person is, you just want a whole bunch of money versus just having enough money to adequately survive. You want a whole bunch of money, and that's more important to you than being together. Not at all what she's saying. But notice how easy it is to do the straw person argument, and how hard it is often, especially with emotionally charged issues like getting married, to correct that argument, to bring it back in line with, no, actually, that's not what I said, that's not what I meant, this is what I meant. Here are the last 5 fallacies that, again, have had a huge impact on how I process information in people's arguments. Begging the question. Begging the question is an attempt it can be circular, but it's basically an attempt not to really prove something, but to be forceful in a presentation. Believe me because of this, but the thing I'm trying to prove, my conclusion, is actually the thing I'm already assuming in my reasons for why you should believe it. It's called begging the question when there's an unproven assumption built into the argument. Here's an example. These are kind of quip phrases, but have you stopped your illegal gambling yet? Have you stopped your illegal gambling yet? If I was to say that to you, I'm already building into this, have you stopped this, with the assumption that you are in fact illegally gambling. And your answer yes or no would somehow validate that you're gambling. So it's already assuming something that it shouldn't. Here's a more popular example. God exists. We know God exists because the Bible says so, and we should believe what the Bible says because God wrote it. God exists. What's my evidence? We know God exists because the Bible says so. Okay, and if the Bible says so, that's important because God wrote the Bible. Wait a minute. How is that an actual argument? This is a begging of the question. It is one big loop. The Bible says God exists. The Bible is true because God wrote it, therefore God exists. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. That's not an argument. It may be true, but not an argument that we can accept on rational grounds. You could accept that on faith or revelatory grounds, saying that the Bible is revelation from God, but not a strong argument. How about this? How can you vote for a dump site that is going to destroy the environment? How can you vote for a dump site that is going to destroy the environment? These are question begging. They're assuming something in there that hasn't been proven. Why are you so defensive? That's a funny one. Why are you so defensive? My wife and I never said that to one another. But if we did, you could see where that would be annoying to the other person, right? Why are you so defensive? I'm not defensive. Yes, you are. And then it blows up in your face because it's assuming something in it that hasn't actually been demonstrated or agreed to. The fallacy of false dilemma. This is a fun one too and quite popular. The fallacy of false dilemma is saying that there are two alternatives, only two alternatives, and you need to agree to this one or to that one. You can't have both. So first of all, that there are only two options, probably unlikely the case. It may be true, but it's highly unlikely that there's two options. So that's the fallacy. But also a part of this fallacy is assuming that they're mutually exclusive and that you can't blend option A with option B, assuming there are just two options. That's an easy way for people to lead us astray. It's overly simplistic, and what's happening is they're trying to limit our possibilities. And they're trying to limit our possibilities for action and belief. Here's an example. Look, you're either in favor of government for support for the arts, or you're an uncultured thug. You're not in favor of government support for the arts, so you're an uncultured thug. It's this idea that you either believe arts are good, or you're an uncultured thug. Well, what about person in the middle who doesn't think the government should support it, but is also in favor of the arts? Well, then they're not an uncultured thug, but they're also not in favor of government support. We've already destroyed that false dilemma. There are a number of reasons that false dilemmas are very persuasive. For some of us, it's that we lack the creativity to think of new possibilities in the moment. And this has happened to me, where someone's presented you with, maybe you're going to order a sub at Subway, and they offer you two different kinds of bread, but you can see there's like 5 different back there. But you panic in the moment and you just pick one of the 2 options instead of reaching out for another or third or fourth option. So it's an unwillingness to push the limits. Creativity, obviously, finding or creating your own alternatives can be very daunting, highly rewarding, I would argue, but quite daunting, intimidating. Maybe sometimes we're afraid of the possibilities or the alternatives, so we quite like just having a binary option of yes or no instead of the middle gray ground that we're not really sure where that might take us or what road that might lead us down, so we just pick the obvious. This could lead into other fallacies like the fallacy of tradition or the fallacy of a popular appeal, where we just kind of accept what the status quo is, what other people are doing. Of course, it may be just that we're lazy, so that's why we like picking one of the 2 options instead of looking for alternatives. Or it may also have a lot to do with our language. Consider how our language pushes us in extremes of yes or no, where we say hot or cold, strong or weak, handsome or ugly, smart or dumb, happy, sad, and so on, heaven and hell, up and down, left and right. We jostle between these extremes. So it's natural then that our language very easily convey a false dilemma, or false disjunct is a more technical term, a false dilemma. Again, healthier living, stronger thinking, better reasoning is to find alternatives and not to get stuck in that limited possibility. The slippery slope fallacy. This is going on quite a bit right now in an age of COVID. Basically, the argument is that taking certain steps will lead to a slippery slope where you try 2 steps and you think they're safe, but then suddenly you're sliding down the slope and you can't stop yourself, and there's danger at the bottom of that hill. So doing A will lead to B, which may seem fine, but then B leads to C, and C leads to D, and D is death for everybody. So there's this idea that it just snowballs, and we see this in terms of vaccine mandates. If the government can mandate federal employees have to have the vaccination, the argument from others is, what will that lead to? Now, they don't have strong examples of what that would lead to. They don't have any examples of having to be mandated to have vaccines will therefore lead to them coming to your home and taking your children from you or something like that. Like, that's not an obvious connection, but it's fear-based. Sometimes these things are in fact slippery slopes, right? You start eating or ingesting too much candy, and then the next thing you know, you're eating more candy and you're not exercising, and then you have diabetes. So you can draw a reasonable connection between A, B, C, and D. But often the slippery slope is the fallacy. mandating vaccines for federal employees stops at mandating vaccines for federal employees. There's no hidden agenda beyond that. There's no evidence to suggest otherwise. And if something else did come up that was an indication of a slippery slope leading to danger, then we would address the issue. But hypothesizing or exaggerating or assuming or predicting or prophesying a future calamity without a direct correlation, without some reasonable grounds to say, and now something X, specifically X, is going to happen, it's just a fallacy, a slippery slope fallacy. Again, there are many things we do in life, like eating too much sugar, going to Dairy Queen, next thing you know, unhealthy overall. But often it's a fallacy. Without evidence, certainly a fallacy. Okay, the last two. Hasty generalization. This is a mistake of thinking that because one experience was this way, therefore other people's experiences will be the same way. Here's an example. You should buy a Dell computer. They're great. Why? Because I bought one and it's been great. A lot of people may have bought Dell computers. That doesn't mean they're actually great. Actually, I bought Dell computer. This one isn't right now. And it was great. It lasted a long time. But the same review for the same computer by many people, it wasn't great at all. I go to my local pizza store. I have pizza there. It's terrible. I tell everyone, never go to that chain restaurant again. I'm committing a hasty generalization. I'm assuming that my experience can be extrapolated to all of the others. A claim about one's experience about this thing becomes less of a hasty generalization when you've had multiple experiences of it and multiple people have had multiple experiences of it. Then you can kind of get a consensus going. This is the basis of scientific understanding, right? Multiple people looking at the same thing in different contexts in different ways, and there's a general agreement about what something means. By contrast, me thinking that my lone opinion, my sample size of being a one-person show, could therefore be extrapolated to a much broader context. So much pride, in fact, that I suggest to you, buy a Dell computer or don't. That's not sound reasoning. It may be true, but I need a lot more examples of that before I suggest to other people, this is a strong argument, buy this kind of computer. The last one is faulty analogy. An analogy is where we compare things to like things and dissimilar things to dissimilar things. And we do that. It's a very persuasive form of language, but we do it to make a forceful argument why you should believe something. So here's an example. I want you to believe this conclusion, and to prove my conclusion, I'm going to draw a list of similarities between two different things. I'm drawing an analogy, why this thing is like this, therefore you should believe this. Dogs are warm-blooded, nurse their young, and give birth to puppies. Humans are warm-blooded and nurse their young, therefore humans give birth to puppies. So dogs are like this, and I could have said dogs have 2 eyes, dogs have 2 ears. Humans are like this, humans have 2 eyes, humans have 2 ears. And then I go to this bottom conclusion that is, of course, absurd and nonsensical. So I'm drawing like, but my conclusion misses the obvious, which is that while there are some similarities between dogs and humans, there are far more dissimilarities. There are far more ways in which we are not alike. Being able to spot a faulty analogy requires spending some effort and time investing in showing why the differences outweigh the similarities. So there you have it, a snapshot of just 15 of many different ways in which thinking can go bad, it can be faulty. They're easy to spot. Again, you may not remember the names right away, but that logic is there. We can't refute the basic reasoning principles, the hasty generalization, the ad hominem attacks, all of these different faulty ways of thinking. As a culture, I've argued this before, we're better off reasoning together and seeing these things for what they are and calling them out when we make mistakes, being honest. I make these mistakes too, and I hope people will call me out when I make those mistakes, so that as a culture, we can do better and not be led astray.